The morning sun was just breaking through the Atlanta airport windows when 17-year-old David rolled his wheelchair through the busy terminal. His backpack was stuffed with debate notes, tournament certificates, and a second-place trophy that barely fit in the front pocket. After 3 intense days of competition, he was finally heading home to Detroit. David had been born with spina bifida, a condition that affected his spinal cord and left him unable to walk. But anyone who knew him would tell you that his wheelchair never slowed him down. In fact, it seemed to make him move through life with even more determination. His friends at school often forgot he was disabled because he was always the first to volunteer for projects, the quickest to crack a joke, and somehow managed to beat most of them in video games despite having to use modified controllers. The UA debate tournament had been the biggest event of his high school career. Teams from all over the country had come to compete, and David's team from Lincoln High had made it all the way to the finals. They didn't win first place, but second wasn't bad for a school that had never even qualified for nationals before. David's coach, Mr. Thompson, had pulled him aside after the awards ceremony. "You know what made the difference this year?" Mr. Thompson had said, adjusting his glasses the way he always did when he was about to make a point. "It wasn't just your research or your speaking skills. It was how you never let anything stop you from making your argument. That's a life skill, David, remember that." Now, wheeling through the airport at 6 a.m., David thought about those words. He was tired but proud. His parents would be waiting for him at Detroit Metro, probably with his favorite pizza already ordered for dinner. His little sister Jenny had texted him about 50 times during the tournament, asking if he'd won and telling him about her own school play rehearsals. The Atlanta airport was already getting busy despite the early hour. Business people in suits rushed past with their rolling luggage. Families with small children struggled with car seats and diaper bags, and college students slept against their backpacks in the waiting areas. David had gotten good at navigating through crowds over the years. He'd learned to anticipate where people would walk, when to speed up, and when to wait patiently for a gap to open up. At the gate, he found his boarding group and waited for them to call passengers who needed extra time. This was routine for David. He'd been flying alone since he was 15 and he knew the drill. Most airline staff were helpful, though some seemed nervous around him, like they weren't sure what to do or say. David had learned to be patient with them too. Flight 447 to Detroit was a typical Tuesday morning flight, packed mostly with business travelers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. David watched them check their phones, sip their coffee, and stare blankly at the departure screens. He pulled out his own phone and texted his mom that he was about to board. "Flight's on time. Should be home by 10 a.m. Can't wait for real food." His mom texted back immediately with about 6 heart emojis and a message about how proud she was. David smiled. His parents had been worried about letting him travel alone for tournaments, but he'd proven he could handle it. This was his 4th solo trip, and each one had gone smoothly. When they called for passengers needing extra assistance, David rolled up to the gate counter. The ground crew member, a friendly woman named Patricia, greeted him with a genuine smile. "Good morning. Flying home after the debate tournament?" she asked, glancing at the trophy sticking out of his bag. "Yes, ma'am. We got second place," David replied, unable to hide his pride. "That's fantastic. Congratulations. We'll get you boarded first so you have plenty of time to get settled." Patricia walked with him down the jet bridge, making small talk about the tournament and asking about his school. It was the kind of interaction that reminded David that most people were genuinely kind when they took a moment to see past his wheelchair. The plane was a standard commercial aircraft with narrow aisles and tight seating. David had flown enough to know that getting to his seat would require some maneuvering, but he'd done it dozens of times before. His seat was in row 12, about halfway back. As he rolled down the aisle, he nodded politely to passengers who looked up from their phones or magazines. That's when he first noticed her. The flight attendant standing near row 10 was checking her watch and tapping her pen against her clipboard with obvious impatience. Her name tag read, "Ms. Rivera," and everything about her body language suggested she was having a bad morning. When she looked up and saw David approaching, her expression shifted to something that looked almost like annoyance. David had encountered this before. Some people seemed to view his wheelchair as an inconvenience, a disruption to their routine. He'd learned to handle these situations with patience and humor when possible. After all, he reasoned, maybe she was just having a tough day. "Excuse me," David said politely as he reached row 12. "This is my seat. Could you help me transfer from my wheelchair?" This was standard procedure. Flight attendants were trained to assist passengers with disabilities, and David had received help transferring from his wheelchair to his seat on every previous flight. It usually took just a couple of minutes, and most attendants were happy to help. Ms. Rivera looked at him like he'd asked her to solve a complicated math problem. She glanced at her watch again, then at the passengers still boarding behind David. "We're running behind schedule," she said curtly. "Can't you just figure it out yourself?" David felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He'd encountered this attitude before, but never from airline staff. Usually, people who worked with the public, especially in customer service roles, were more professional. "I understand you're busy," David replied, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "But I do need assistance to transfer safely. It's airline policy, and it's also the law under the Americans with Disabilities Act." He'd learned about his rights through years of advocacy training that his parents had encouraged him to attend. Knowledge was power, his dad always said, especially when you're fighting for basic respect and dignity. Other passengers were starting to notice the interaction. An older businessman in row 11 looked up from his laptop, and a mother traveling with 2 young children glanced over with concern. The boarding line behind David had come to a complete stop. Ms. Rivera's expression hardened even more. She looked around at the watching passengers, then back at David. It was clear she felt put on the spot, and David could sense that his polite but firm response had only made her more irritated. "Look, kid," she said, her voice loud enough that several nearby passengers could hear clearly. "I've got a whole plane to deal with, and I can't spend all day playing nurse. You're going to have to manage on your own." The words hit David like a physical blow. In all his years of flying, in all his experiences with ignorant comments and thoughtless behavior, no one had ever been quite so deliberately cruel. The watching passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and David felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. But David had been training for moments like this his entire life, just not in the way he'd expected. All those hours practicing debate, learning to control his emotions under pressure, and standing up for what was right were about to be put to the ultimate test. This wasn't a competition anymore. This was real life, and David was about to discover just how powerful his voice could be. David sat in his wheelchair, staring up at Ms. Rivera in complete disbelief. Her words echoed in his head like a broken record. "I can't spend all day playing nurse?" The phrase cut deeper than any insult he'd ever heard because it came from someone who was supposed to help him, someone whose job it was to make sure all passengers felt safe and respected. The airplane aisle had gone completely quiet. Even the usual sounds of passengers settling in, overhead bins closing, and flight attendants making announcements seemed to fade into the background. David could feel dozens of eyes on him, and he knew that everyone around him had heard exactly what Ms. Rivera had said. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair tighter than usual. 17 years of living with spina bifida had taught him to expect ignorance from some people. But this felt different. This wasn't just someone being uncomfortable or not knowing what to say. This was deliberate cruelty from a professional who should have known better. "Ma'am," David said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "I'm not asking you to play nurse. I'm asking you to do your job. Federal law requires airlines to provide assistance to passengers with disabilities." Ms. Rivera rolled her eyes in a way that made David's stomach turn. She looked around at the other passengers as if she were the victim in this situation, as if David were some unreasonable teenager making impossible demands. "Listen here," she said, stepping closer to David's wheelchair and lowering her voice to what she probably thought was a threatening whisper. "I don't know what kind of special treatment you get at home, but this is the real world. You bought a ticket just like everyone else, which means you need to handle your own problems just like everyone else." The businessman in row 11 cleared his throat uncomfortably. The mother with the 2 children was watching the whole scene with her mouth slightly open, clearly shocked by what she was hearing. Her kids, probably around 8 and 10 years old, were staring too, trying to understand why the nice lady in the uniform was being so mean to the boy in the wheelchair. David took a deep breath. His debate coach had always taught him that the person who stays calm in an argument usually wins, even when the other person is being completely unreasonable. But this wasn't a debate tournament. This was his life, his dignity, and his basic rights being trampled on in front of a plane full of strangers. "I understand you might be having a difficult day," David said, still keeping his voice respectful, "but I need to transfer to my seat safely. I can't do that without assistance. It's not special treatment. It's basic accommodation that's guaranteed by law." Ms. Rivera's face turned red, and David could see that his calm response was making her even angrier. Some people, he'd learned, got more upset when you refused to match their anger with your own. They wanted you to lose control so they could justify their behavior. "Don't you dare lecture me about the law, kid," she snapped, her voice now loud enough that passengers several rows away turned to look. "I've been doing this job for 12 years and I know exactly what I'm required to do and what I'm not required to do." David felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about getting help to his seat anymore. This was about every person with a disability who had ever been made to feel like a burden. Every kid in a wheelchair who had been told they were asking for too much. Every human being who had been treated as less than equal because they needed accommodation. Then you know that under the Air Carrier Access Act, you're required to provide assistance with boarding, deplaning, and moving to and from seats, David said, his voice getting stronger. You also know that treating passengers with disabilities differently or refusing reasonable assistance is discrimination. The older businessman suddenly spoke up. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Ms. Rivera, "but the young man is right. I'm an attorney, and what you're doing right now could get you and this airline in serious legal trouble." Ms. Rivera whipped around to face the businessman, her anger now directed at him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to mind your own business and let me do my job." "This is everyone's business," said the mother with the children, her voice quiet, but my kids are watching this and I'm not going to let them think it's okay to treat people this way." David felt a wave of gratitude toward these strangers who were willing to speak up for him, but he also felt embarrassed that the situation had escalated to this point. All he had wanted was to get to his seat so the flight could take off on time. Instead, the entire boarding process had stopped, and he was at the center of a conflict he never wanted to be part of. Ms. Rivera seemed to realize that she was losing control of the situation. The other passengers were clearly on David's side, and more people were starting to pay attention to what was happening. She looked around nervously, probably realizing for the first time that her behavior was being witnessed by dozens of people, many of whom had their phones out. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But we're doing this quickly because we're already behind schedule." She moved toward David's wheelchair with obvious reluctance, her movements sharp and impatient. David began the process of locking his wheelchair brakes and positioning himself for the transfer. He'd done this hundreds of times before, and it usually went smoothly when he had proper assistance. But Ms. Rivera wasn't interested in helping properly. Instead of waiting for David to position himself safely, she grabbed the back of his wheelchair and started pushing it toward the seat before David was ready. "Wait," David said, trying to keep his balance as his wheelchair moved unexpectedly. "I need to—" "We don't have time for this," Ms. Rivera interrupted, continuing to maneuver the wheelchair roughly. David felt himself sliding forward in his seat as the wheelchair was pushed at the wrong angle. He reached out to grab the airplane seat for support, but Ms. Rivera was moving too fast and too carelessly. The wheelchair hit the armrest of the airplane seat hard, and the impact sent David sliding toward the edge of his wheelchair. "Stop," David called out, but it was too late. Ms. Rivera gave the wheelchair one more aggressive push, trying to get it closer to the seat, and David lost his balance completely. He fell forward, his body twisting awkwardly as he tried to catch himself. His shoulder hit the airplane seat hard, and he slid down into the narrow space between the seats and the aisle. The sound of David hitting the floor seemed to echo through the entire airplane. His textbooks and tournament materials scattered everywhere, papers flying under seats and notebooks sliding down the aisle. The second-place trophy that had been balanced on his lap clattered to the floor and rolled several rows back. For a moment, everything was completely silent. David lay on the airplane floor, his body twisted uncomfortably, pain shooting through his shoulder and back. He could feel the rough airplane carpet against his cheek, and he was acutely aware that everyone on the plane was staring down at him. Then the voices started. "Oh my God, are you okay? Somebody help him." "What is wrong? With you?" The businessman was already out of his seat, kneeling beside David. The mother was gathering up his scattered papers, her children helping to collect his books. Other passengers were standing up, trying to see if David was hurt, offering to help. But Ms. Rivera just stood there looking down at David with an expression that seemed more annoyed than concerned. "Well," she said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact, "maybe next time you'll be more careful." Those words would haunt David for the rest of his life, but they would also be the catalyst for something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. David's hands were shaking as he pulled himself up from the airplane floor with help from the businessman and another passenger. His shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the seat, and his back ached from the awkward fall. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in his chest. He could feel every pair of eyes on the plane watching him, and Ms. Rivera's cruel words kept echoing in his head. The businessman, who had introduced himself as Mr. Chen, helped David get settled into his airplane seat while other passengers continued gathering his scattered belongings. The mother with the 2 children handed him his debate notes, which were now wrinkled and out of order. Her kids looked at him with the kind of innocent concern that only children show, not yet old enough to hide their emotions behind polite smiles. "Are you hurt?" the little girl asked, holding out his second-place trophy. "I'm okay, sweetheart," David managed to say, though his voice came out shakier than he intended. "Thank you for helping me." Ms. Rivera had disappeared toward the front of the plane, probably hoping everyone would forget what had just happened. But David could hear passengers murmuring to each other, their conversations filled with words like terrible, discrimination, and unbelievable. Some were already pulling out their phones, and David realized that videos of the incident were probably already being uploaded to social media. As the plane continued boarding and other passengers found their seats, David sat in row 12 trying to process what had just happened. In 17 years of life, he'd faced ignorance, pity, and even some cruelty, but nothing quite like this. Ms. Rivera hadn't just refused to help him. She had deliberately caused him to fall and then acted like it was his fault. His first instinct was to call his parents. His mom would be furious, and his dad would probably want to drive to the airport immediately to confront Ms. Rivera himself. But as David stared at his phone, he remembered something that had happened 3 months earlier. It was at a youth leadership conference in Washington, D.C. David had been selected along with 20 other students from across the country to participate in a week-long program about civil rights and advocacy. The program was designed to teach young people how to stand up for themselves and others when they faced discrimination. On the 3rd day of the conference, they had a special guest speaker. Attorney General Rebecca Martinez had come to talk to the students about disability rights and the importance of speaking up when those rights were violated. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, but when she spoke about justice, her voice carried the weight of authority. "Discrimination thrives in silence," she had told the group of students. "When someone violates your rights, when someone treats you as less than equal, that's when you have to be strongest. That's when you have to use your voice, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you." After her speech, Attorney General Martinez had stayed to talk with the students individually. When she got to David, she had asked him about his experiences with discrimination and how he handled difficult situations. "You know," she had said, "I can tell you're someone who thinks before he acts. That's a good quality, but sometimes when something really wrong happens, you can't just think about it. You have to act." Before she left that day, she had done something that surprised David. She had given him her business card with her direct phone number written on the back. "This isn't something I do often," she had explained, "but something tells me you might need this someday. If you ever face serious discrimination, especially from a government agency or a company that should know better, I want you to call me directly. Don't hesitate. Don't worry about bothering me. That's what I'm here for." David had kept that card in his wallet for 3 months, never imagining he would actually use it. It seemed too important, too serious for someone his age to have direct access to the Attorney General of the United States. But as he sat on that airplane, his shoulder still aching and Ms. Rivera's words still ringing in his ears, he realized that this was exactly the kind of situation she had been talking about. Airlines were regulated by the federal government. They received government contracts and had to follow federal laws about how they treated passengers with disabilities. Ms. Rivera hadn't just been rude to him. She had violated federal law, and she had done it in front of dozens of witnesses. David pulled out his wallet with trembling fingers and found the card. Attorney General Rebecca Martinez's phone number was written in neat handwriting on the back. For a moment, he hesitated. What if she didn't remember him? What if she was too busy to take his call? What if he was overreacting? But then he looked around the airplane and saw the faces of the passengers who had witnessed what happened. Mr. Chen was still looking at him with concern. The mother with the children kept glancing back to make sure he was okay. These people had seen something wrong happen, and they knew it was wrong. This wasn't about him being too sensitive or asking for special treatment. This was about basic human dignity and equal treatment under the law. David took a deep breath and dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This is Attorney General Martinez." "Ms. Martinez," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is David Rodriguez. We met at the Youth Leadership Conference in Washington 3 months ago. You gave me your card and told me to call if I ever faced serious discrimination." There was a brief pause, and then her voice became more focused. "David, yes, I remember you. The young man from Detroit who was on the debate team. What happened?" David had spent years learning how to present arguments clearly and logically, but this was different. This was personal. He took another deep breath and began to tell her exactly what had occurred, from the moment he asked Ms. Rivera for assistance to the moment she told him he should have been more careful after causing him to fall. Attorney General Martinez listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for specific details like the flight number, the airline name, and Ms. Rivera's exact words. David could hear her taking notes on the other end of the line. "David," she said, when he finished his account, "what you're describing is a clear violation of the Air Carrier Access Act. This isn't just poor customer service. This is federal discrimination, and it's exactly the kind of case that needs to be addressed immediately." "I don't want to get anyone in trouble," David said, though he wasn't sure he meant it. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to other people." "That's exactly why this matters," Attorney General Martinez replied. "David, I need you to stay calm and stay on that plane. Don't let them take off yet. I'm going to make some phone calls right now, and there are going to be some people who want to talk to you and the other passengers who witnessed this incident." "What kind of people?" David asked. "The kind of people who have the authority to make sure this never happens again," she said firmly. "And David, you did the right thing by calling me. This took courage, and I'm proud of you for standing up not just for yourself, but for everyone who travels with a disability." As David hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't expected. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and humiliation, he felt powerful. For the first time in his life, he had used his voice not just to debate a theoretical issue, but to fight for real justice in the real world. He had no idea that his phone call was about to change everything. David hung up the phone and sat back in his seat, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Around him, the airplane was settling into its normal pre-flight routine. Passengers were buckling their seatbelts, flight attendants were doing their safety checks, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom announcing that they would be taking off in about 15 minutes. But David knew something the other passengers didn't. Attorney General Martinez had told him to make sure the plane didn't take off, and he had a feeling that was about to happen whether he did anything or not. Mr. Chen, the businessman who had helped him earlier, leaned over from the seat across the aisle. "Are you feeling better?" he asked quietly. "That was quite a fall you took." "I'm okay," David replied, though his mind was racing. "Actually, I think things are about to get very interesting." Mr. Chen raised an eyebrow, but didn't push for more information. David could see that several other passengers were still watching him with concern, including the mother with the two children who kept glancing back to make sure he was all right. Meanwhile, Ms. Rivera had returned to the main cabin and was going through her usual pre-flight routine as if nothing had happened. She was checking overhead bins, reminding passengers to put their seats upright and preparing for takeoff. David watched her move through the cabin with the same professional efficiency she had probably shown on thousands of flights before this. 1. She had no idea that her world was about to change forever. The first sign that something was different came about 10 minutes later. Captain Johnson's voice came over the intercom again, but this time he sounded confused and slightly concerned. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received a message from air traffic control asking us to hold our position for a few more minutes while they sort out some paperwork. We apologize for the delay and expect to be airborne shortly." David felt a small smile creep across his face. Attorney General Martinez worked fast. Ms. Rivera appeared at the front of the cabin, speaking quietly into her headset. David couldn't hear what she was saying, but her body language had changed. She kept glancing toward the cockpit and then back at the passengers, and her confident demeanor from earlier seemed to be slipping away. 5 minutes later, the captain's voice returned, and this time he sounded genuinely puzzled. "Folks, I'm sorry for the continued delay. Air traffic control is asking us to return to the gate for what they're calling an administrative issue. This is unusual, but we need to comply with their instructions. We'll have you back at the gate in just a few minutes." A collective groan went up from the passengers. Business travelers started checking their watches and their phones, calculating how this delay would affect their connecting flights and meetings. The mother with the children sighed and started digging snacks out of her carry-on bag to keep her kids occupied. But David felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was really happening. Attorney General Martinez had made those phone calls, and now federal authorities were getting involved. He thought about all the times he had felt powerless when faced with discrimination, all the moments when he had just accepted unfair treatment because he didn't know what else to do. Not this time. As the plane slowly taxied back toward Gate B-17, David could see through his window that something unusual was happening on the ground. There were more vehicles than normal around the gate area, including what looked like federal law enforcement cars and airport security vehicles. Ms. Rivera was now moving through the cabin with obvious anxiety, her earlier confidence completely gone. She kept looking toward the cockpit and speaking into her headset in hushed, urgent tones. David could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool temperature in the cabin. The plane came to a stop at the gate, and the usual sounds of engines winding down filled the cabin. But instead of the normal announcement about staying seated until the seatbelt sign was turned off, Captain Johnson's voice came over the intercom with a message that made everyone sit up and pay attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked by federal authorities to remain in our seats while some officials board the aircraft to speak with our crew and potentially some passengers. This is not a security issue, and there is no danger to anyone on board. We ask for your patience and cooperation during this process." The buzz of conversation that followed was immediate and intense. Passengers started speculating about what could be happening. Some wondered if there was a problem with the plane. Others worried about terrorists or security threats. A few people started taking out their phones to text family members or post updates on social media. David sat quietly, watching it all unfold. He felt nervous, but also proud. For the first time in his life, he had stood up for himself in a way that actually mattered, that actually had consequences. The aircraft door opened and several people in suits began boarding the plane. They moved with the kind of purposeful authority that made it clear they were federal agents. David could see airport security officers and what looked like airline executives following behind them. Ms. Rivera's face had gone completely pale. She was standing near the front of the cabin, gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles were white. One of the federal agents approached her and spoke quietly. Even from row 12, David could see her hands shaking as she nodded and followed the agent toward the front of the plane. Another agent, a woman with short gray hair and a serious expression, walked down the aisle, scanning the seat numbers. When she reached row 12, she stopped and looked directly at David. "Mr. Rodriguez?" she asked politely. Yes, ma'am, David replied, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm Agent Thompson with the Department of Transportation. Attorney General Martinez asked me to speak with you about an incident that occurred during boarding. Would you be willing to answer some questions? David nodded, acutely aware that every passenger within earshot was listening to every word. Agent Thompson pulled out a small recording device and a notebook. Can you tell me, in your own words, exactly what happened from the time you boarded this aircraft? As David began to recount the incident, he could see other agents moving through the cabin, speaking quietly with passengers who had witnessed what happened. Mr. Chen was talking earnestly with one agent, using his hands to demonstrate how Ms. Rivera had pushed David's wheelchair. The mother with the children was explaining to another agent what she had seen and heard. Several passengers were taking videos with their phones, and David realized that this story was probably already spreading on social media. He could imagine the headlines: Disabled Teen Calls Attorney General After Flight Attendant Discrimination, or Federal Agents Board Plane After Disability Rights Violation. When David finished giving his statement, Agent Thompson asked him several follow-up questions about his injuries, his previous experiences flying, and his knowledge of disability rights law. She was thorough but kind, treating him with the respect and dignity that Ms. Rivera had denied him. As the agents continued their work, David could see Ms. Rivera through the aircraft window. She was standing on the jet bridge, surrounded by officials, and even from a distance, David could see that she was crying. He felt a complex mix of emotions watching her. Part of him felt satisfied that she was finally facing consequences for her actions, but another part of him felt sad that it had come to this. He hadn't wanted to destroy anyone's career. He had just wanted to be treated like a human being. The entire process took about an hour. When the agents finally finished their investigation, Agent Thompson returned to David's seat one more time. Mr. Rodriguez, she said, I want you to know that what you did today took real courage. Most people would have just accepted what happened and moved on. By speaking up, you've helped ensure that other passengers with disabilities won't have to face this kind of treatment. As the agents left the aircraft and the crew prepared for a very different kind of flight than anyone had expected, David realized that his life had just changed forever. He was no longer just a teenager who happened to use a wheelchair. He was someone who had stood up to injustice and won. 3 weeks later, David sat in his bedroom staring at his laptop screen in amazement. The story of what happened on Flight 447 had spread far beyond anything he could have imagined. News outlets across the country had picked up the story, and social media was still buzzing with discussions about disability rights and airline treatment of passengers. His phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests from reporters, advocacy groups, and even some television shows. His parents had helped him decide which interviews to accept and which to politely decline. They wanted him to tell his story, but they also wanted to protect him from being overwhelmed by all the attention. The immediate consequences had been swift and serious. Ms. Rivera had been fired from the airline within 48 hours of the incident. The Department of Transportation had launched a full investigation into the airline's disability accommodation practices and had found several other violations that had never been reported. The airline was facing federal fines that could total more than $200,000. But for David, the most meaningful part wasn't the punishments or the money. It was the messages he had been receiving from people all over the country who had similar experiences. Just that morning, he had gotten an email from a woman named Patricia who used a wheelchair and had been refused assistance by airline staff 3 different times in the past year. She had never reported any of the incidents because she thought nothing would be done about it. Your story gave me the courage to file my own complaint, she had written. I realized that staying quiet wasn't protecting me. It was just protecting the people who were treating me badly. Another message came from the parents of a young man with cerebral palsy who had been denied boarding on a flight because the crew said his wheelchair was too complicated to accommodate. They had accepted the airline's explanation and booked a different flight, not realizing that what happened was illegal. The stories kept coming. A veteran who had lost his legs in combat and had been told by a flight attendant that he should have warned them he was heavily disabled when he booked his ticket. a college student with a visual impairment who had been refused assistance navigating the airport because the staff member said it wasn't their job to be a seeing eye person. Each message broke David's heart a little bit, but also made him more determined to keep speaking out. He was starting to understand what Attorney General Martinez had meant when she said that discrimination thrives in silence. The airline industry had taken notice too. Within 2 weeks of David's story going public, 3 major airlines had announced new mandatory training programs for all staff on disability rights and accommodation procedures. They were also implementing new oversight systems to make sure that incidents like David's would be reported and addressed immediately. David's debate coach, Mr. Thompson, had called him the day after the story broke in the national news. "You know what you did, don't you?" he had said over the phone. "You took everything we taught you about making a compelling argument and you used it to change the world. I've never been more proud of a student." The recognition was nice, but what meant the most to David were the small changes he was seeing in his daily life. At school, students who had never paid much attention to accessibility issues were suddenly asking questions about what it was like to navigate the world in a wheelchair. His younger sister Jenny had started pointing out to their parents when restaurants or stores weren't wheelchair accessible, saying David wouldn't be able to go there. His parents had been worried about him at first, afraid that all the attention would be too much pressure for a 17-year-old to handle, but they were also incredibly proud. His mother had framed the first newspaper article about his story and hung it in the living room, right next to his debate team photo. "You know, what your father and I realized," she had told him one evening over dinner. "We spent so many years teaching you how to adapt to a world that wasn't built for you, but we never taught you that sometimes the world needs to be the one that changes." 2 months after the incident, David received a phone call that changed everything again. It was Attorney General Martinez calling to let him know about a new development. "David," she said, "I wanted you to be the first to know. The Department of Transportation is creating a new position, a disability rights advocate who will work specifically on cases like yours. It's a full-time federal position dedicated to investigating discrimination complaints and making sure airlines follow the law." "That's amazing," David replied, though he wasn't sure why she was telling him personally. "The reason I'm calling," she continued, "is that we want to name this position after you. The David Rodriguez Disability Rights Advocate position would be responsible for ensuring that no passenger ever has to go through what you experienced." David was quiet for a long moment, overwhelmed by the idea that his name would be associated with a federal position dedicated to protecting people like him. "There's something else," Attorney General Martinez added. "We'd like you to be involved in training the person who gets this job. Your experience, both with what happened on that flight and with how you handled it afterward, makes you uniquely qualified to help train federal investigators." 6 months later, David found himself standing in a conference room in Washington, D.C., facing 20 federal agents who specialized in civil rights investigations. He was there to tell his story and teach them about the real-world impact of disability discrimination. "When Ms. Rivera told me she wasn't paid to be a nurse," David told the group, "she wasn't just being rude to me personally. She was expressing an attitude that says people with disabilities are burdens that society has to carry, rather than equal members of society who deserve the same respect as everyone else." One of the agents raised her hand. "How do we make sure that our investigations capture not just the legal violations, but the human impact of discrimination?" David thought for a moment. "You have to remember that behind every complaint is a person who was made to feel less than human. When you investigate these cases, you're not just enforcing laws. You're telling people that their dignity matters, that their rights matter, and that someone is watching out for them." After the training session, David was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Agent Wilson, the first person hired for the David Rodriguez Disability Rights Advocate position. "I want you to know," she told him, "that every day when I come to work I think about your story. It reminds me why this job is so important. Every complaint I investigate, every case I work on, I'm thinking about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." As David flew home to Detroit that evening, he looked around the airplane and smiled. The flight attendant had greeted him warmly when he boarded, had helped him transfer to his seat without being asked, and had checked on him twice during the flight to make sure he was comfortable. It was such a simple thing, being treated with basic respect and dignity. But David now understood that simple things weren't always easy to achieve. Sometimes you had to fight for them. Sometimes you had to be willing to make a phone call that would change your life and the lives of countless others. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. There were 3 new emails from people thanking him for speaking out, 2 interview requests from advocacy organizations, and a text from his little sister asking if he would come talk to her class about standing up for what's right. He smiled and started typing his response to Jenny. "I'd be honored to talk to your class. Tell them we're going to talk about how one phone call can change the world." As the plane descended toward Detroit, David realized that his story wasn't ending. It was just beginning.